Welcome to the Politics and Public Finance Podcast, in-depth conversations that bring unique insights into the nexus between how governments manage our finances and the work of elected representative bodies such as parliaments. You're listening to Politics and Public Finance Podcast with Jeff Dubrow and this week's guest, political actionist Carol Chan, Democratic governance experts Charmaine Rodriguez and Kevin DeVoe. Join the conversation with Jeff Dubrow.
Welcome to you all. So we're going to be talking today on the inaugural edition of Politics and Public Finance, not so much about politics and public finance, but more about democracy and the future of democracy. And we're going to start by focusing on the political events that have happened here in Canada for the last 3 weeks. But Charmaine, who is in Melbourne, Australia, will be able to comment more on the fact that what's happening in Canada is not just happening in Canada. So let me start by setting the context. And this goes back a little bit to the work that I did, and I suspect a couple of other people on the call may have been in the same situation. You know, about 25 years ago, just after the collapse of the Soviet Union, democracy had beat authoritarianism. We had won, so to speak, in very simplistic terms. And so, you know, the work that we were doing at the time, or the work that I was doing at the time, was very much focused on sharing the model of democracy abroad. Right? For better or for worse, that's what we were doing. And there was a contagion, right? That countries were adopting democratic systems, and we were celebrating the fact that more and more countries were adopting the democratic model. And again, for right or for wrong, we could have a conversation about that in itself. Where the turning point exactly was, we can discuss or debate, but I would start by talking about, of course, the election of Donald Trump in 2016, where the question started to become: can we apply authoritarian model to what is inherently a democratic system? It's kind of the opposite of the experiment that we tried in the former Soviet Union, where we were applying a democratic model to what had been an authoritarian system. January 6th, I think, obviously, is a defining moment for us, where you know, we went from questioning democracy to actually being in a situation where we had people actively trying to overturn an election and an election result. And so that got me concerned about Canada, but more about from the top down, more about from the situation of, do we need to shore up our democracy at the top? Because we have in our system, and Charmaine, you'll identify with this in Australia, you know, an executive branch, a prime minister with a lot of discretionary power. And so I was really thinking about closing the loopholes at the top. Well, sure enough, about 3 weeks ago, there was the massive trucking protest began. And what we started to see was people calling for not all of them, but some of them calling for the overthrow of the democratically elected government. And this set off some concerns on my part and some alarm bells. And this is what I really want to talk to you about: is what is the future of democracy, given the situation that we're in now. Kevin, you're a former parliamentarian. Why don't we start with you?
I appreciate this opportunity, Jeff, and I'm happy to be here with Carol and Charmaine. So last year, as part of my work for the UN, I ended up working on leading a team doing research on hate speech, but very much a lot of these same issues have been unpacked as part of that. So let me just try to, in summary, pick up a few of the points. First of all, Jeff, I would say I think the shift from democracy over authoritarianism to the backsliding of democracy started in 2007 when Facebook became a social media site that everyone was following. It is the gasoline on top of what has always been there: a fringe minority or an us against them mentality that can grow. It's not the only variable, but it's a key variable, and I'm happy to talk about that as we go forward. The other one is we've had 42 years of trickle-down economics in the Western world. That's created a lot of economic inequality. As much as people, you know, there are people I know in my own, well, probably it's the same in New Brunswick next door. You know, this is a place that economically hasn't done very well, and then suddenly with COVID, everyone is house rich. And so I think even though there are some people who benefited from COVID economically, there's a lot more people who've been impacted. And that is really just sort of an acceleration of what was probably happening over the last 40 years. So you've got economic inequality. There's lots of research out there that shows that that has been tied to polarization. When you have economic inequality, people are more likely to be open to populist or polarized positions. Once you have that, you have people begin, and you see this with the truckers, but I'm sure it's probably the same in Australia, but I'll let Charmaine talk about that. You have people who believe this is the fight of their lives, that this is the battle that they have to take for freedom, for God, or for whatever. And when you have that situation, they're willing to accept democratic backsliding as an acceptable option in order to win the battle. And so we're now in a circumstance where people are not talking to each other, or at least not in cross sort of ideological groups, and they're focused on social media and other small groups that are driving the same sort of echo chamber. And as a result, we have a situation in which there are people who have a very different take on reality and what they're willing to do in order to fight for what they believe in. And that's where we're at. And we can talk about this as we go forward. But in my mind, it's economic inequality leads to polarization. When you add social media, you have a perfect storm. Add COVID as well, make that another component. You've got a perfect storm in which people are willing to buy into agendas that are not democratic.
Thank you, Kevin. Charmaine, let's go to you. Kevin was nice enough to actually put me in touch with you because he assured me that Canada was not alone in facing these demonstrations. In fact, yes, we know there were some ripple effect from the Canadian trucker demonstrations, but why don't you tell us what's been going on in Australia?
Sure. Look, in fact, it's interesting because it looks like your protests followed our protests and then our protests followed your protests again. So as you said, I'm from Melbourne, Australia. So Melbourne famously has had the longest lockdown in COVID in the world. And that obviously led to unhappiness. We also was interested that Justin Trudeau has just used his emergency powers. So all of our states except New South Wales use their emergency powers. And there were criticisms that they were used too much and for too long because we obviously had to keep extending them. Why are you extending them if COVID's going to end soon? So we extended them for 2 years. We had small protests every time we were looking at opening up, but unsure about opening up. We then last year, ironically, when they tried to pass a package of reforms to take these not fit for purpose emergency powers, which may be a conversation we also have later on, that when they tried to do that, the amount of misinformation that is in society, Kevin is 100% right. Social media is where the trolls live. It's also where I get a lot of my news, to be honest. But they were whipped up that this was the worst possible bill, another power grab, terrible. So we had large protests here in Melbourne. Interestingly, if you read the left-wing commentary, points were being made that it was actually better than New South Wales legislation and approximately the same as New Zealand's legislation. But we also, and so Kevin picked up a few issues, social media is one, but we also have an incredibly concentrated media in Australia. So apparently the stat is, I think we're the third most concentrated after North Korea and somewhere else because Murdoch owns 70% of our papers or TV channels or radio channels. So there was a very clear proposition that Melbourne bad because of a left-wing government. Our restrictions were bad. New South Wales good. The state next to us and the other big state because they have a conservative government. So all of this was feeding in, and I suspect it's similar to you, as Kevin says, disenfranchised people being whipped up by traditional media, having their small spaces in social media where they really can feel like they're being heard. There are other people out there like me who would have been harder to find in big countries like both of ours, right? We have challenges just around bringing people together because we're so large. That's fixed now. So people in different states have come together over this. I don't know if that's happened in your province. Actually, it is because the truckers have come from everywhere. The then shorter point then being, we had this in a massive way last year. It was terrible. Arrests, brutality. And then when you started your trucker convoy, it all settled, and we have had a trucker convoy go to Canberra. And it's interesting again to see, and I think we will talk about it later, but where people are trying to empathise with the truckers here and there, we had marches against women, and our Prime Minister famously said, "Isn't it nice that people can protest? Because similar protests are being met with bullets in Myanmar." He said it on the day of the protest when women came in the streets. When the white truckers came, he said, everyone has a right to protest. They are exercising their right to freedom of speech. So I think so much involved in where these have come from and how they're being managed by politicians who've lost their sense of national interest, in my opinion. They're much more about whipping the vote than protecting our core values. And maybe that's something we'll get into as well.
Yeah, and we've certainly seen that in Canada. I mean, I think there's a broad consensus at the national level. There has been a stunning failure of leadership, which has really led to the declaration or the invocation of the Emergencies Act. People are asking whether there's been an overreach, but the reality is we went from complete inaction to really, I think, the only mechanism that was left. So when it comes to the undermining of democracy, we're questioning democracy as a system. Can you talk a little bit about what Australia has faced in that regard?
Look, as I said, I mean, some of our critical problems are, and I really, so I'm obviously don't believe, I'm not a fake news nut. But one of our big problems is obviously the media. They've picked camps, and they're also, I believe, not being responsible. We literally are getting massive misinformation, which you can see directly relating to protest, directly relating to the angst in society. In fact, on that, to just come back, I was interested when you said you were first interested in top-down approaches to responding to how we democratic renewal. And it's a real...
we'll come back to that. Yeah, go ahead.
Conversation, though, when I look at it, because we always tried for top-down solutions because it's easier, we think, to fix the structures via a few people than fix the mass, because that's just such a massive project. But it's something that in development you're not allowed to say anymore. We have to do top-down, bottom-up, meet in the middle, work on all of these different factors. And it's interesting because when I look at what's happened, instead of, as you said, everyone being dragged forward, I feel we've regressed. So if we thought we were helping developing countries do better, we are all now together doing worse. We've all become the Modi, not taken India and had them become the Mandela or the great leader, whoever we think that is. And some of that surely has to be around that as well, how, there are so many problematic structures. Our political parties are highly unaccountable in Australia. We have a relatively dominant two-party system, a little bit like yours, but I think you've done better than us. Those two parties are incredibly hard to get inside of. You work up, you do the right thing, you don't question people. So they're just making little robots of each other, none of whom are representative, that's not fair, but most of whom aren't representative of their communities. All of this campaign finance, so the fact that money is buying power and that disenfranchises all of us, including people who are even further from power than the middle class, the lower classes who've never had access to any of these people. These are some of the things I was thinking about. I know it's happening with us. I see it happening in England and America. I suspect it's happening in Canada as well. And we're going to have to work that bottom piece as well, I think. The structures are what people like us do because we're all middle class or upper middle class. And we've never really properly worked that bottom piece. Although I was lower middle class. I'm a migrant. My parents didn't have degrees. We've also, the Democrats and the Republicans in America talk about how to talk to a poor person. Wow, that's all about our political classes being from the wrong places, having no experience. We blood them as young advisors, and then we make them our politicians. We have to deal with that.
Carol, this is a good segue to come to you. Thank you, Charmaine. This is a good segue to come to you because of the issue we were talking about top-down approaches. How do you work with the executive and legislative branches to strengthen and shore up democracy? And we might come back to that, but given the protests and given the symbols of hate that we've seen and the type of hateful rhetoric that Charmaine made reference to, how are you seeing the situation and what do you think needs to be done to shore up democracy?
Thanks, Jeff. Wow, I wish I had written down everything Kevin and Charmaine had said, because it's like they're reading my brain, but saying it better. And at the same time, I guess I'm one of the people who is more on the ground. I don't work in policy so much. I'm an aspiring politician, but I haven't made it there like Kevin. And I'd say this is really more of an opportunity for two things. For those of us who do think systems, it's really important for us to reflect on the system we have. When Kevin mentioned democratic backslide, I kind of wondered, that assumes that the point we were at was a good one. It assumes that, and I really would like to just take a moment just to recognize that I am sitting on Wolastoq, Mi'kmaq, and Passamaquoddy traditional territories, if not only to make the point that there were other systems here before democracy that may have worked for people too. And so I think that it's important for us who think about these things deeply and actually interact with the people who live within and work within the system to say, who does this system serve? Does it really serve the citizens of this country, broadly speaking, or is it kind of bread and circus and we're making them feel okay with certain things? The other aspect of it is for everyone who thinks that they ascribe to and belong to and are proud of Canadian democracy or Australian democracy, a Western democracy of some sort. I think it's a deep questioning that we all have to do so that we practice daily democracy. I think we were going to hit at some point in this discussion whether we are at a critical point, and in some ways the people who have infiltrated the trucker demonstration, because I'm not going to say it's the truckers themselves that brought this to the fore, they've done us a favor, because those feelings were there, those thoughts were there, they were being exchanged on the internet, and before that they were in somebody's head. They're just being on display now. And so it's incumbent on all of us to actually respond to that. Not just a politician. I am highly disappointed in the political reaction in Ottawa as well. But at the micro level, each of us needs to, in the same sense that we need to be anti-racist rather than just not racist, or not racist, whatever that is, or pro-feminist and pro-women instead of just I'm not a masochist, or I think, sorry, a misogynist. I think that those are the things that we have to do on a daily basis in daily practice. And I'd like to just actually go to the notion that came in my mind when I saw the title for the podcast. You'll have to remind me though, Jeff, what it was, because I don't have it in my notes. I think it gave a sense of urgency and emergency, really. But I think that what we're seeing really is a good reminder that democracy is not threatened by a bunch of protesters. It's threatened by complacency. And that is really where we can, through our day-to-day practice of just watering the plant, maybe protecting the plant from being crushed or whatever, those are the things that we need to do in day-to-day. We're not used to doing it because we used to think that democracy, protecting democracy, meant like going to a foreign country and fighting a war, or working for an NGO and helping the people.
Installing a foreign system.
Yeah, whereas it really is in our day-to-day practice.
Yeah, interesting. And just going to that point, there has been a lot of discussion in the media on the fact that protesters of other classes, sexes, and races, those fighting for social justice, are not afforded the same courtesy and deference, in fact, that the protest movement has received. How does that affect our democracy? Are we in a situation where that double standard is affecting confidence in our legal system? Kevin, why don't we start with you on that?
Okay. Well, I'll be the cat amongst the pigeons on this. I'm not necessarily, I agree with the premise. I think that this is a better organized protest led by people who are former military and former police officers, and they know how to entrench. And the fact that they brought trucks makes it very difficult to remove them. They're just better at protesting. I think there are examples in the past in this country where protests have been allowed to go on for a lot longer than 3 weeks or 2 weeks. I will just say that. But I think, and maybe I'll talk about this more as we go through. I think one of the challenges is, and maybe this is sort of the old school New Democrat in me, but it's about economic issues. Bernie Sanders talks about this all the time in the United States as well. That's the golden thread that ties us all together. And until we start to address economic inequality and the impact it's having, particularly on people who haven't been able, for whatever reason, to get a college or post-secondary education, they're the ones being left behind. And yes, many of them are white, but they're also racialized. They're also BIPOC. A good portion of them are women. But there's a golden thread there that I think we need to be working on, because I think unless you do, all we're doing is creating and sowing potentially divisions that I think can be an issue in the long term. I don't disagree with whatever we've been talking about around, the need to address, anti-racism for being a non-racist, or, I don't know what the term is for women, but anyway, not misogynist, but pro-feminist or whatever, anti-misogynist. But the point is that these things are important and they need to be moved forward, but I think they need to be moved forward in a way that ensures that we have as much of the population on board as possible. And I think there's a segment, and I think Charmaine was talking about that, particularly working class, who feel that they're being left behind, and that's not going to work. And they're going to, I will assure you, in Canada, Australia, wherever, probably starting in the United States, it's going to get worse unless we do something with that. So,
and on that note, it's interesting in Canada, Carol, I'll pose this question over to you. We do have at the national level a government that is a self-styled feminist government. One can certainly argue and pull apart the success that they've had, but there are certainly gains that have been made in terms of the openness of putting forward a feminist and a more diverse political approach, if you like. Are these, is the rise of the right in Canada, are these completely separate phenomenons, or are they somehow linked together? What are your thoughts on that, Carol?
Well, as a racialized person, I think we're all racialized actually, but my color is just one that gets put in that category. Who was born and raised in Canada, I would say that my experience from having been born in British Columbia and raised there, lived in Quebec for some of my education, and then come here, I don't think things have changed that much, frankly. We're just hearing it more. And I think the difference is now that we're moving to a place where everybody knows better, but is not doing better. The difference being, when I was young, people didn't know that they shouldn't be racist or sexist. And we've gone through all the talking about what we should do. We have this feminist government, I guess, but we're not doing better. I would have to disagree with Kevin. He probably knows more about the tactical and has probably analyzed the logistics of the protests in much greater depth than I have. But I would just say that the fact that the response has been so muted politically and even encouraging politically has been very disappointing, because allyship isn't about necessarily bringing out the big guns. Allyship is about saying, this isn't cool, and you're not allowed to do that because you don't have rights that trump everybody else's rights. They have to fit into this thing that we call a country and a democracy. And when the elected leaders don't do this, it certainly gives me a sense that whether or not they label themselves as a feminist government or a multicultural government or whatever you want to call it, they're not acting like it. And it's not just the elected officials, but it's everyone else who isn't taking a stand out there.
Wow, what a perfect way to end the conversation. Thank you, Carol. So Carol Chan in Moncton, New Brunswick, Kevin DeVoe in Eastern Passage, Nova Scotia, and Charmaine Rodriguez in Melbourne, Australia. I myself am in Moncton, New Brunswick. You've been listening to the Politics and Public Finance podcast with myself, Jeff Dubrow. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast on whatever platform you're listening to, and go over to the YouTube page and hit that subscribe button, and we will see you next time. Thank you again to all of you very much for a very prolific discussion.